Courtroom 7 was cold, the kind of cold that came from high ceilings and insufficient heating, and the specific institutional indifference of a building that processed serious things without concern for the comfort of the people being processed. Franny Calder could see her own breath when she exhaled. She sat alone at the defendant's table. 67 years old, narrow shoulders, wearing Edmund's coat, the old canvas work coat he had worn for 20 years of field work, too large for her, by 2 sizes, the kind of garment that held a person's shape after enough years of wearing. She had put it on the morning after he died and had not found a reason to take it off. Across the room, Chester Bramwell sat beside his attorney. Harold Finch, the suit charcoal, the briefcase, the kind that communicated expense as a form of argument. Chester had the relaxed posture of a man who had already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. And in the witness area, waiting, her hands folded in her lap, her face carrying the specific expression of a woman performing reluctance, was Margaret Dwyer, 88 years old. Franny's mother, Judge Diana Redmond, looked up from her papers. She said, "Mrs. Calder, where is your attorney?" Franny stood. The coat shifted around her, too large, moving with her rather than fitting her, the coat of a man built differently from the woman now wearing it. She said, "I don't have one, Your Honor." Chester made a sound, short, the sound of a man receiving confirmation of something he had expected and found satisfying. Finch's expression arranged itself into the professional near smile of someone managing amusement in a formal setting. And Margaret, her mother who had driven 4 hours to sit in this witness area, shook her head, the slow, small headshake of a woman communicating that this was entirely predictable. Franny said, "I don't have the funds. The house, the accounts, the car, everything was frozen after Edmund died. I have $47. Chester said quietly enough to be heard by the room. "This will be a short proceeding." Franny did not respond to this. She looked at her hands. Then she reached up and began to unbutton Edmund's coat. Slowly, the first button, the second, the specific unhurried pace of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and is not going to be rushed about doing it. She said, "Your Honor, I don't have an attorney, but I have my husband. He was a private investigator for 42 years. And before he died..." Third button. She said, "He left me a few things." She turned the coat over. The lining had been sewn by hands that were not a seamstress's hands, rough stitches, uneven, the stitches of a man working quickly, working against time, working with the knowledge that he had limited time left and specific things to accomplish before it ran out. Sewn into that lining 6 photographs, an envelope, a USB drive the size of a thumb. The room was still. Chester Bramwell was no longer making sounds. Margaret Dwyer's hands had stopped moving in her lap. Finch was looking at the lining of an old canvas coat with the expression of a man who has just understood that the proceeding he prepared for is not the proceeding that is about to occur. Franny held the coat. She said Edmund couldn't be here, but he did what he always did. She said he watched, he listened, he kept the evidence. He left her the truth. The courtroom clock read 9:47 when Harold Finch rose to open for the plaintiff. He was good at openings. Franny could see that immediately, the specific practiced ease of a man who had done this many times and had learned that the opening was about establishing a picture in the minds of the people in the room before the evidence arrived to complicate or confirm it. He wanted the picture in place first. Then the evidence would look like illustration rather than argument. He said the plaintiff, Chester Bramwell, is the closest living relative of Edmund Roy Calder, who passed away 6 months ago after a 14-month illness. Edmund Calder was a man of modest but real accumulated assets, a house, a vehicle, savings representing 40 years of careful work. He was also in the final years of his life a man in significant physical decline. He said the defendant, Frances Calder, known as Franny, married Edmund 8 years ago, when Edmund was 61 and already experiencing the early indicators of the illness that would eventually claim his life. The plaintiff does not contest the marriage. The plaintiff contests the circumstances under which a woman with no prior connection to the Calder family came to be the sole beneficiary of those accumulated assets. He said the evidence will show that Frances Calder entered this marriage at a moment of particular vulnerability in Edmund Calder's life, that she managed his affairs, controlled his communications, and positioned herself as the primary, indeed the only relevant person in his life during his illness, that the estate planning that benefited her so entirely was conducted under her influence and with her active involvement. He said the plaintiff asked this court to look carefully at a marriage of 8 years that produced a result benefiting one party completely and leaving the decedent's family with nothing. He sat down. Franny had been listening to this with her hands in her lap and Edmund's coat across the back of her chair. She had heard variations of this argument before, had been hearing variations of it for 8 years from Chester at family occasions, from the cousins who had decided without much investigation that she was exactly what Finch was describing. She had stopped being hurt by it approximately 4 years into the marriage when she had understood that the people who believed it had decided to believe it, and no evidence of her actual life with Edmund was going to alter that decision. She was hurt by something else today. Judge Redmond said the plaintiff may call its first witness. Finch said the plaintiff calls Margaret Dwyer. The sound in the room when an 88-year-old woman walks to the witness stand is a particular sound, the specific combination of a cane on a hard floor and the quality of attention that a very elderly person commands simply by moving through a space. Margaret Dwyer moved with the specific upright carriage of a woman who had always been concerned with how she appeared, and had not stopped being concerned with it because of age. She was wearing her good dress. Franny recognized it, the navy blue with the white collar, the dress her mother wore when she wanted to communicate respectability. She had worn it to Franny's first school play, to her own 70th birthday party, to Edmund's funeral. She was wearing it today to testify against her daughter. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the room with the expression of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was ready to say it. Finch approached. He said, "Mrs. Dwyer, how long have you known the defendant?" Margaret said, 67 years. She's my daughter. He said, "And in those 67 years, would you describe yourself as someone who knows Frances Calder well?" Margaret said, "Better than anyone. Better than Edmund did. He only had 8 years. I have her whole life." He said, "Based on that knowledge, that lifetime of observation, can you tell the court what you believe about the nature of Frances's marriage to Edmund Calder?" Margaret's posture did not change. She said, "My daughter never loved Edmund Calder. She married him because she was 59 years old and had nothing. No money, no house, no prospects. Edmund was a decent man who was lonely after his first wife passed, and he didn't see what was in front of him." She said Frances has never been able to hold on to anything. Jobs, relationships, money. She'd been working in a veterinary clinic for 20 years for barely more than minimum wage. Then she meets Edmund, who has a house and savings and no one watching out for him, and within a year they're married. She said, "I know my daughter. She's not capable of the kind of love that deserves an inheritance." Franny had her hands flat on the table in front of her. She was not gripping the table. She had decided sometime in the drive to the courthouse that morning that she was not going to perform anything in this room, not composure, not grief, not the controlled dignity of a woman being wronged in public. She was going to feel what she felt and let her hands be still and do what Edmund had spent the last months of his life making possible. But she was feeling it. The specific pain of hearing your mother describe you to strangers was a pain with no good comparison. It was not like other pain. It did not come from outside. It came from the place where you had first understood yourself, the voice that had named you, that had told you what you were before you had any other information, and when that voice described you as nothing. The nothing landed somewhere that other words could not reach. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the afternoon 14 months ago when he had sat down beside her at the kitchen table with the specific quality of stillness he had when he had decided something and wanted to tell her carefully. He had said, "I know what Chester is going to do after I'm gone. I know your mother will go along with it if he asks her to. I've been watching for 2 years and I need to tell you what I've found." She had said, "Edmund." He had said, "I'm a detective, Franny. It's what I know how to do. Let me do this." She had let him. Finch finished his examination. Judge Redmond looked at the defendant's table. She said, "Mrs. Calder, do you have questions for this witness?" Franny stood. The coat moved with her. She had put it back on at some point without noticing the way you put on something that belonged on you. She said, "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "But first I'd like to ask my mother one question." Judge Redmond said, "Proceed." Franny looked at Margaret, not with anger, with the specific, steady attention of a woman who has been looking at something for a very long time and has finally decided to look at it directly and completely without the protective softening she had been applying for 50 years. She said, "Mama, how much did he pay you?" The room was very still. Margaret's face did not move, but something in her hands did. The cane shifted against the floor. A small adjustment, the involuntary motion of a body responding to something the mind has decided not to show. Chester was looking at his attorney. Finch was looking at Franny. Franny was looking at her mother. She was still holding Edmund's coat. The courthouse had a small room off the main corridor where witnesses waited before being called. Franny had walked past it on her way in and had seen through the narrow window in the door her mother sitting in one of the plastic chairs with her cane across her knees and her hands folded and her back straight. She had not stopped. She had kept walking, and she had gone into Courtroom 7 and sat down at the defendant's table and put Edmund's coat across the back of her chair and waited for 9:47. She was doing what she had always done with things that were too large to think about directly. She was setting them aside until there was a use for them, a skill she had developed early, a skill she sometimes thought that her mother had inadvertently given her by making the direct approach so consistently painful that she had learned young to come at difficult things from the side. She had been the middle child. Carol was 2 years older, pretty easy, the daughter who had made Margaret feel that she had done something right. Gary was 4 years younger, sharp, ambitious, the son whose achievements Margaret collected the way other women collected figurines. Between them, Frances, who was none of those things. She had understood this about herself early because Margaret had not concealed it. "You're not going to be pretty. You might as well be smart." The day she had turned 8. "You're not going to be smart. You might as well be useful." The year she had failed algebra. "I don't know what you're going to be." The night of her high school graduation said with the specific exhaustion of a woman who had stopped expecting. She had become a veterinary technician. This had not impressed Margaret. She had worked at the Millbrook Animal Clinic for 21 years, cleaning and assisting and doing the less visible work of a practice that served the animals people loved, which was work that required patience and steadiness and the specific willingness to be present with something that was suffering without the ability to explain what was wrong. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Her mother called it cleaning up after animals. She had stopped correcting this approximately 12 years in. Edmund Calder had walked through the clinic door on a Tuesday afternoon in March with a dog that was not his. She found this out later. The dog belonged to a neighbor who was elderly and couldn't drive and had called Edmund because Edmund was the person you called in the neighborhood when something needed doing. He had carried the dog in, wrapped in a flannel shirt, a 15-year-old beagle who had gotten into something in the yard and was moving badly. He had set the dog on the examination table and stepped back and watched Franny work with the specific attention of someone who was accustomed to watching people and understanding what they saw. She had not noticed him watching. She had been watching the dog. Afterward, when she had finished and the dog was stabilized and the neighbor had been called and the flannel shirt was in the laundry bin, he had still been in the waiting room. He had a cup of coffee from the machine in the corner, which was a terrible machine that produced something technically classifiable as coffee, and he was reading a 6-month-old magazine. And when she came out, he had looked up and said, "How is she?" Franny had said, "She'll be fine. She got into something in the compost. We'll keep her overnight." He had said, "Thank you. You were very good with her." She had said, "It's my job." He had said, "A lot of people do their job. Not everyone is good at it." She had gone back to work. He had come back the next day to collect the dog, and the day after that with a small plant for the front desk and a question about whether she would want to have coffee sometime, the real kind, he said, not from a machine. She had been 59 years old and had not been asked this particular question in a very long time. She had said yes. They had been married 11 months later in a ceremony with 2 witnesses and the specific quiet happiness of 2 people who had not expected to find each other and were not going to waste time performing the finding for an audience. Her mother had not come. What her mother had said when Franny called to tell her, "Les mots on gya sapchat." You always were good at finding the ones who can't get away. She had been 60 years old when her mother said this to her. It had landed the same way the comments had always landed, not with the shock of something new, but with the specific dull weight of a thing that had been falling on the same place for so many years that the place had changed shape. Edmund had been in the kitchen when she came off the phone. He had looked at her face. He had not asked what had been said. He had simply put his arms around her and held her until she stopped being whatever she was being, and then he had made tea, and they had sat at the table, and he had told her about the first case he had ever worked as a private investigator, a case that had nothing to do with anything, a case about a missing parrot in 1983. And by the time the tea was cold, she had been laughing. That was Edmund. He had been diagnosed 14 months before he died. The illness had the specific trajectory of the aggressive kind, not slow, not gradual, but a series of steps downward, each one lower than the last, each one requiring another adjustment to what ordinary life looked like. Franny had made the adjustments. She had done it the same way she did everything without announcement, without requiring credit for it, with the specific quiet competence of a woman who had spent her working life attending to things that needed attending to and had not developed a habit of expecting to be thanked. Edmund had noticed anyway. He always noticed. 3 months before he died, on an afternoon when the light in the hospital room was the flat gray of a November afternoon and the monitors were doing what monitors did, and Edmund was more tired than he wanted to admit, he had taken her hand. He had said, "I need to tell you something." She had said, "Edmund, you don't need to." He had said, "I've been working." She had looked at him. He had said, "I'm a detective, Franny. I don't stop being a detective because I'm in a hospital. I've had 2 years of watching, and I've been making calls, and I've been careful about it. I didn't want to worry you, but I also couldn't leave without making sure." He had said, "I found things. About Chester. About your mother." She had said, "My mother." He had looked at her the specific look of a man who had been a detective for 42 years and had learned to deliver difficult information in a way that did not add damage to truth. He had said, "I can't tell you everything now. I'm too tired today, and I want to tell you properly. But I need you to remember one thing." He had tightened his hand around hers. He had said, "The coat. My old canvas coat, the one I wore in the field. Don't throw it away. Don't give it away. No matter what anyone says, keep it." She had said, "The coat with the broken left pocket." He had said, "I fixed the pocket. Keep the coat." He had closed his eyes. She had held his hand until he slept. She had driven home that evening and gone to the closet where the coat hung, and she had looked at it, the old canvas worn at the elbows, the specific shape of a garment that had been worn by a specific person through specific weather for years. And she had understood without opening it that whatever was inside it was the last thing Edmund would ever do for her. She had closed the closet. She had gone back to the hospital. She had not opened the coat until the morning of the hearing. Judge Redmond had given her the floor at 10:19. Franny stood. She had the coat on. She had put it on after the opening arguments because the courtroom was cold in the specific way of institutional buildings that regulated their temperature for the comfort of no one in particular, and also because wearing Edmund's coat was something she had been doing for 6 months and she did not see a reason to stop. She said, "Your Honor, I'd like to tell the court about my husband." The judge said, "Proceed." She said Edmund Roy Calder was a private investigator for 42 years. Before that, 3 years with the county sheriff's department, which is where he learned the work. He was the kind of man who noticed things. It wasn't a professional habit, it was how he was built. He paid attention to what was in front of him, and he remembered it, and he connected it to other things he had noticed before, and eventually a picture developed. That was how he worked. That was how he had always worked. She said, "When Chester Bramwell first told Edmund that he intended to contest the estate, this was approximately 2 years ago, when Edmund had received the diagnosis, and Chester apparently decided it was time to begin planning. Edmund did not respond the way Chester expected. He didn't argue. He didn't consult attorneys. She said he opened a case file, a sound from Chester's side of the room. Finch put his hand on Chester's arm. Franny continued. She said Edmund was 69 years old and had been diagnosed with a progressive illness, and he was depending on the weak in considerable pain. He was also a man who had spent 4 decades understanding that the best time to gather evidence was before anyone knew you were gathering it. He understood that Chester was going to make a legal argument, and he understood the nature of that argument. He had heard versions of it for 8 years, and he decided to prepare a response. She said he called a former colleague, a man named Roy Tillman, who had worked with Edmund for 18 years and who is now retired in Tucson. Edmund asked him to come back to town for a few weeks. He didn't explain why. Over the phone, Edmund never explained anything over the phone. It was a professional habit that never left him. She said Roy Tillman came. Edmund briefed him. And then Roy Tillman did what private investigators do. He watched and he photographed and he documented. The Hoi Tuong came to her in the specific way that recent memories came, not as images, exactly more as qualities of light and sensation. The hospital room. The way Edmund's hands looked in the last months thinner than they had been, the specific change that illness made in the hands of people who had worked with their hands their whole lives. The afternoon he had told her about the coat. She had gone home that evening and she had not opened it. She had gone back the next day and the day after that, and she had held his hand while the monitors did what they did, and she had talked to him about the animals at the clinic where she still occasionally volunteered, about the beagle from the neighbor who had been healthy for 3 years now, about the ordinary accumulation of days that was their life. He had died on a Wednesday morning in April. She had come home to a house that was the same house it had been the day before and entirely different. She had opened the closet on the 3rd day. The coat had hung there the way it always hung, heavy canvas worn at the elbows, the left pocket that Edmund had repaired, with the careful, uneven stitching of a man who was not a seamstress, but was determined to finish what he had started. She had put her hand into the left pocket and felt the stitching along the interior seam, and understood that the pocket was not actually the pocket anymore. It was an envelope, a compartment, a thing Edmund had made in the last months of his life, with hands that were not as steady as they had been, and a determination that had not diminished with the steadiness. She had found the photographs. She had found the envelope. She had found the USB drive. And she had understood, standing in her kitchen in April with Edmund's coat in her hands and the light coming through the window at the angle it always came at that time of day, that the last case Edmund Calder had ever worked was the case of his own wife's inheritance. Chester said, "Your Honor, this is inadmissible. Any alleged evidence that was not disclosed in pretrial proceedings." Judge Redmond said, "Mr. Finch, control your client." Finch said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff objects to the introduction of any material that has not been." Judge Redmond said, "I have not yet been shown the material in question, Mr. Finch. I cannot rule on its admissibility until I have seen it. Mrs. Calder is providing context for evidence she intends to produce. That is a standard preliminary statement. Sit down." Finch sat. Chester sat. The judge looked at Franny. She said, "Continue." Franny said Roy Tillman photographed a series of meetings that took place over 3 months, approximately 18 months ago. The meetings involved Chester Bramwell, Harold Finch, the attorney seated at the plaintiff's table, and one other party. She said the photographs have timestamps. They are dated. They show the location of each meeting and the participants at each meeting. She said one of the photographs shows Chester Bramwell and Harold Finch meeting with a woman at a diner on Route 9. The meeting lasted 41 minutes. Roy Tillman photographed them from across the street. She said, "I recognized the woman in the photograph immediately. She said I had been looking at that woman my entire life." The room was quiet. Margaret Dwyer in the witness area had gone very still. Franny said Edmund also asked Roy Tillman to record one of the meetings. Roy had the equipment-old habit, 40 years in the trade. He recorded the meeting at the diner. The recording is on the USB drive in the coat. She said, and the third item, the envelope, contains a letter, a handwritten letter, dated approximately 14 months ago. She said it is addressed to me. She said it is signed by my mother. Chester turned to Finch. Finch was not looking at Chester. He was looking at the coat. At the specific place on the left side of the coat where the pocket sat the repaired pocket, the uneven stitches the work of Edmund Calder's hands in the last months of his life. Margaret Dwyer's cane had shifted against the floor. Just slightly. Just enough. Franny looked at the judge. She said, "Your Honor, I would like to present the evidence." Her hand went to the first button of the coat. The room held its breath. She said, "My husband was a detective for 42 years. He couldn't walk to the end of the driveway at the end, but he could still think, and he could still plan, and he could still pick up a phone and ask a friend to come and help him do what he had always done." She said, "He gave me these last months of his work, and I have been carrying them literally every day since he put them there." She looked down at the coat. She said, "He couldn't be here today, but he did what he always did." First button, she said, "He watched." Second button, she said, "He listened." Third button, she said, "He kept the evidence." She turned the coat over. The lining, the rough, uneven stitches of a man working against time, the photographs tucked flat, the envelope, the USB drive the size of a thumb. She looked at the judge. She said, "Shall I proceed, Your Honor?" She began with the first photograph. She removed it from the lining the way Edmund had placed it carefully with both hands, holding it at the edges the way you held something that mattered. She walked it to the clerk's desk and set it down. She said, "Photograph 1, dated 14 months ago, a Tuesday in October, 11:43 in the morning, Chester Bramwell and Harold Finch at a corner table at the Route 9 diner. Roy Tillman took this from the parking lot across the street." She returned to the coat. The second photograph. She said, "Photograph 2, same location 3 weeks later, Chester Bramwell, Harold Finch, and a third party. The third party is my mother, Margaret Dwyer. This is the first documented meeting between Chester, his attorney, and my mother. The timestamp is November 9th. Edmund had been diagnosed for 4 months at this point. Chester had been telling the family for 2 months that he intended to contest the estate. She set it on the clerk's desk beside the first. The room had the quality it had had when she opened the lining, the specific held-breath quality of people who are watching something unfold and are not yet certain what it will become. Margaret Dwyer in the witness area was looking at a point on the wall above the judge's head. Not at the photographs. Not at Franny. At the wall. Third photograph. She said, "November 30th. The same diner. Chester Finch and my mother. This meeting lasted 53 minutes according to Roy Tillman's notes. You can see that my mother has a notepad on the table." Roy could not read what she was writing from his position. Fourth photograph. She said, "December 19th. The same 3 parties. Roy Tillman noted that this appeared to be a shorter meeting, approximately 20 minutes. The timestamp shows they arrived separately and left separately." She paused. She held the 5th photograph. She said, "Photograph 5. January 7th. Same location. This is the meeting where Roy Tillman was able to position himself closer. There was construction on the far side of the parking lot that gave him better cover." She set it on the clerk's desk and stepped back. Anyone who came to look at it, and in a moment people would come to look, would see 3 people at a corner table, and they would see Chester Bramwell slide an envelope across the table, and they would see Margaret Dwyer's hand close around it. The envelope was thick. Margaret's cane hit the floor. She said, "Those are fabricated. That is not whatever that shows. It is not what it looks like. I never—" Judge Redmond said, "Mrs. Dwyer, you are not currently being questioned. Sit down." Margaret said, "She is lying. She is always—" Judge Redmond said, "Mrs. Dwyer, sit down or I will have you removed from the witness area." The cane scraped against the floor. Margaret sat. Her hands were shaking, the specific shaking of a woman in her late 80s whose body was expressing what her face was working not to express. Chester had turned to Finch. Finch was looking at the 5th photograph on the clerk's desk. He had the expression of a man running a rapid internal calculation, the specific expression that Franny had seen very occasionally on the faces of the animals she had worked with when they understood that the situation they were in was not the situation they had expected. Franny returned to the coat. She removed the envelope. She said, "This is a letter. It is handwritten. I would like to read the relevant portion into the record." She said the letter is addressed to Chester Bramwell. It is unsigned, but the handwriting is my mother's. I have looked at my mother's handwriting my entire life. I would know it in any condition, in any light. She opened the envelope. She read, "Chester, I will do what you need. I'll tell them she never loved him, that she only wanted the money that I know my daughter, and she's not capable of that kind of loyalty. I've said it before, and I'll say it under oath. But I need what we discussed. The $30,000 is not enough. I'm 88 years old, and I have medical expenses, and if I'm going to stand up in a courtroom and say these things about my own child, I need $50,000. Not 30. If you want my testimony, it costs what it costs." She folded the letter. She said my mother did not deny writing this letter. She denied that the photographs were authentic, but she did not deny the letter. She set it on the clerk's desk. She said, because the letter is in her handwriting, and she knows it. The room was doing what rooms did when something significant had happened, the specific collective recalibration of people processing information that had arrived differently from what they expected. Chester was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the table in front of him at the surface of it, with the specific focused attention of a man who has made his face very still because he does not yet know what expression it should be wearing. Finch had not moved. He was still looking at the fifth photograph. And Margaret was looking at Franny. For the first time since she had taken the witness stand, she was looking directly at her daughter. Not at the wall, not at the judge, at Franny. Franny looked back. She did not offer her mother anything in the look. Not comfort, not accusation, not the performed coldness of a woman demonstrating injury. She looked at her mother the way she looked at things she needed to assess clearly, the way she had looked at animals in distress, the way she had looked at Edmund in his last months, with the specific open attention of a person who is willing to see what is actually there. What was there was an 88-year-old woman who had been caught. Not just caught in this room in this proceeding. Caught having been exactly what she had always been. Franny's hand went to the coat one more time. The USB drive was in the repaired pocket, the left pocket, the one Edmund had sewn closed with his uneven stitches, the last repair job of a man whose hands were not steady but whose intention was precise. She held it up. She said my husband recorded the fourth meeting. Roy Tillman had better equipment than the meeting warranted Edmund's words when he told her about it. Edmund had asked him to use it anyway. Edmund had believed that the meeting on December 19th was the meeting where the terms were finalized, and he wanted the terms on record. She said the USB contains 67 minutes of audio. I have not played it for anyone. I brought it here because Edmund kept it for here. She held it in her palm. She said, and this is not all of it, Your Honor. She said my husband was a detective. He documented what he found. He also, in the way of a thorough man finishing a case, wrote a summary. A 2-page summary of his investigation, his methodology, and his conclusions. She said it is also in the coat. She reached in one more time. She removed a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. At the top, in Edmund's handwriting, the handwriting she had been reading for 8 years, the compressed, careful script of a man who had spent decades writing things down, precisely a single line. "For Franny, in case I'm not there." She held it. She did not read it aloud. She set it on the clerk's desk with the photographs and the letter and the USB, and stood for a moment with her hands at her sides and the coat open and the lining visible with its rough, uneven stitches and the empty places where the evidence had been. She said, "Your Honor, that is what my husband left me." She said he spent the last months of his life making sure I would have what I needed. She said he was a detective for 42 years. He was also my husband for 8 years, and in my experience, those were the same thing. The audio expert arrived at 11:40. His name was Garrison, a compact man in his 50s with the specific unhurried efficiency of someone who had been called to courtrooms before and knew that the work mattered more than the drama surrounding it. He carried a laptop and a small external speaker and a kit of the kind that forensic audio examiners carried, and he sat up at the clerk's desk with the businesslike focus of a professional completing a familiar task. Judge Redmond had called the recess at 11:12 after Franny had placed the USB on the clerk's desk and requested authentication. She had said the court will verify this evidence before it is presented. We will reconvene when Mr. Garrison has completed his examination. The examination took 26 minutes. Franny sat at the defendant's table during the recess and did not look at Chester's side of the room. She looked at her hands. She thought about Edmund, about the specific patience of him, the way he had always said that the most important part of any investigation was the waiting, that evidence didn't reveal itself to people who were in a hurry. She thought about him at the end in the hospital room with the monitors and the light and his hand in hers, and the way he had said, "I've been working," the specific pride in that, the specific love of a man who could not do many things anymore and had found the one thing he could still do and had done it. She was not going to waste it. Garrison returned at 12:16. He set his laptop on the clerk's desk and connected the external speaker and addressed the judge. He said, "I've examined the USB drive for evidence of editing, splicing alteration, or any form of post-production modification. The audio file is unaltered. The recording is continuous, no breaks, no cuts, no sections of added or removed audio. The timestamp embedded in the file metadata is consistent with the date in question. The recording is authentic." Judge Redmond said, "Can you identify the speakers?" Garrison said, "I can offer a preliminary assessment. There are 3 distinct voices on the recording. I can't provide a formal voice identification without comparison samples and more time, but I can tell the court that the 3 voices are clearly differentiated and consistently present throughout the recording." The judge said, "We'll proceed with the preliminary understanding that the voices are unidentified for now. The court will hear the recording. If the parties recognize voices, they are free to say so on the record." She looked at Franny. She said, "Mrs. Calder, this is your evidence. Do you wish to address the court before we hear it?" Franny stood. She said, "Just one thing, Your Honor." She said, "When I listened to this recording for the first time 2 weeks ago, in my kitchen at 2 a.m. because I couldn't sleep, I heard 3 things that I want the court to hear too." She said, "I heard my mother's voice. I have been listening to that voice for 67 years. She said, "I heard Harold Finch's voice. I have heard that voice in this courtroom this morning." She said, "And I heard Chester Bramwell's voice. I have heard that voice at family dinners and holiday gatherings and Edmund's funeral and in this courtroom this morning." She said, "I am not going to tell the court who is speaking in this recording. I am going to let the court decide." She sat down. Garrison pressed play. The recording began with ambient sound, the specific background texture of a diner, which was a particular combination of kitchen noise and low conversation, and the occasional sound of dishes that created a white noise distinctive enough that anyone who had spent time in a diner would recognize it immediately. Then voices. The first voice, a man, the measured, unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to choosing his words for effect. The recording said, "The question is whether her testimony will be credible. She's 88. They're going to look at her and think elderly, possibly confused." A second voice also, a man lower, more clipped. It said, "She's sharp enough. I've spoken with her twice. She has very specific opinions about her daughter. They're not going to seem fabricated because they're not fabricated. She actually believes them." The first voice, "That's actually better. Genuine contempt is more persuasive than performed contempt." A third voice now. A woman's voice, older, with the specific quality of a voice that had spent decades being the authoritative voice in a room and had not lost the habit. It said, "She is weak. She always has been. She'll cry and she'll get confused and she'll back down. That's what she does. She did it when she was 8 years old and she does it now." A brief silence on the recording. Then the first voice again, "We need you to be specific. Not just character. We need specific instances, things that establish a pattern of." The woman's voice, "I have 67 years of instances." A sound that might have been quiet laughter. The second voice, "The payment. We discussed 30,000. The woman's voice, without hesitation, maybe a pause. The second voice, "That's the woman's voice. I am standing up in a courtroom and telling them my daughter is a fraud. I am doing that at 88 years old, and I am doing it under oath. 50,000. Another pause. The first voice, fine. The woman's voice, and I want cash, not a check, not a transfer. Cash before I set foot in that courtroom. The recording continued. There were 8 minutes of it. The court heard the voices discuss the specific testimony Margaret would provide, the characterizations of Franny's motives, the anecdotes that would be presented as spontaneous recollection, the framing of the marriage as calculated rather than genuine. They heard Finch coach Margaret on the language of testamentary capacity, the specific phrases that would land with legal weight. They heard Chester confirm in his own voice that the goal was to establish that Franny had manipulated a sick man and that the estate should therefore be returned to the family. At one point, the first voice said, "What if she produces something?" She had access to his files. The woman's voice said, "She doesn't have anything. She was a vet tech. She doesn't understand legal documents. She'll show up and she'll fall apart." The recording ended. The speaker produced a small pop and then silence. The silence in the courtroom was the silence of a room in which something has been heard that cannot be unheard, the specific quality of information that has rearranged the way everyone present understands what they are looking at. Chester Bramwell's hand was gripping the arm of his chair, the grip of a man who needs to hold on to something and has chosen the nearest available thing. Finch had his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Not dramatically, the specific contained movement of a man who has understood the shape of what has happened and is processing it without looking at anyone while he does. Margaret Dwyer was sitting in the witness area with her cane in both hands upright, the posture she had maintained all morning. But her face had changed. Not dramatically, the same face, the same arrangement of features that had been telling Franny who she was for 67 years. But something had gone out of it. The specific quality that had always been there, the certainty of a woman who had decided what she knew and was not revisiting the decision, was gone. What was left was older than certainty. What was left was a woman who had been caught and knew it, and was not yet sure what she was on the other side of being caught. Judge Redmond removed her glasses. The room watched her do it. She looked at the plaintiff's table. She looked at Chester Bramwell, specifically at the man who had spent the morning presenting himself as the aggrieved family member, the rightful heir, the person protecting Edmund Calder's legacy from a woman who had taken advantage of a dying man. She said, "Mr. Bramwell." Chester looked up. She said, "I have been on this bench for 17 years. She said, I have heard a great many things in this courtroom. Evidence of fraud, evidence of coercion, evidence of the specific and various ways that people use legal proceedings to do things that the law was not designed to facilitate." She said, "What I have just heard, a recorded conversation in which a witness was compensated for testimony, in which that compensation was negotiated and confirmed, in which the specific content of perjured testimony was discussed and rehearsed, is among the most deliberate abuses of this court's process that I have encountered in 17 years. She put her glasses back on. She said, "Mr. Finch, before I say anything further, I want to give you the opportunity to address the court." Finch took his face out of his hands. He looked at the judge. He said in the quiet voice of a man who has made a calculation, "Your Honor, I request a recess to confer with my client." The judge said, "You may have 15 minutes. She looked at the room. She said, "This court is in recess." She stood. As the room stood with her, Franny looked at the USB drive on the clerk's desk, the small thing the size of a thumb that Edmund had asked Roy Tillman to use the good equipment for. He had known. He had known that Chester would not be subtle, that Finch would not be careful, that Margaret would negotiate for more money in a diner with a man in the parking lot across the street. He had been a detective for 42 years. He had known people. He had known, too, that Franny would walk into a courtroom alone and would need something that could speak when she could not, something that carried the voices of the people who had arranged her defeat and would play them back in the room where they had expected to win. He had given her their voices. She picked up the coat from the back of her chair. She put it on. Finch requested the cross-examination at 1:17. The 15-minute recess had stretched to 40, during which Franny had sat in the hallway on the same bench where she had sat during the document examination that morning, and had eaten the sandwich she had packed because she had known the way she always knew. The way an animal knew what a day required, that she would not have the focus to eat in the courtroom and would need food at some point. She had eaten half the sandwich. She had looked at the wall. She had thought about Edmund. Not strategically, not planning what she would say or how she would say it. Just Edmund. The specific weight of his arm around her shoulders in the evenings. The way he made coffee, which was a production involving exact measurements that she had teased him about for 8 years. The last morning, not in the hospital, the last morning at home, 3 weeks before the end, when he had been well enough to sit at the kitchen table and she had made eggs the way he liked them, and they had not talked about anything in particular. That was enough. She had gone back into the courtroom. Finch stood. He had spent 40 minutes reconstituting himself. She could see it in the quality of his posture, the specific reassembled composure of a professional who had encountered a setback and had decided that the only path forward was to continue moving. He was good at this. You did not get to be Harold Finch without being good at recovery. He approached the defendant's table. He said, "Mrs. Calder, the photographs that were entered into evidence today, you obtained them from a man named Roy Tillman. Is that correct?" Franny said Edmund obtained them. Roy Tillman took them at Edmund's request. Finch said, "And Mr. Tillman is not present in this courtroom today." Franny said, "No. He's in Tucson. Edmund passed away before he could arrange for Roy to appear, but the photographs are here and the authentication." Finch said, "I'm asking about Mr. Tillman's absence. The court has heard testimony about photographs taken by a man who is not present to be cross-examined about the circumstances under which they were taken, the equipment used, or whether they accurately represent what they purport to represent." He said, "You are not a photography expert. You cannot authenticate these images beyond saying that Edmund Calder told you they were genuine." Franny said the court examiner authenticated them. Finch said the court examiner authenticated that the images have not been digitally altered. That is a different question from whether the images show what you say they show, or whether the people in them are who you say they are. He said you identified one of the figures as your mother based on your personal recognition. You have no independent corroboration. Franny said, "I've been looking at my mother's face for 67 years. I recognized her." Finch said, "With respect, Mrs. Calder, personal recognition is not forensic identification." He paused. He said, "Similarly, the recording. You've asked this court to accept that the voices on that recording belong to my client, to the witness, Mrs. Dwyer, and to myself. You have no voice identification expert. You have a preliminary assessment from an audio technician that the recording is unedited, which tells us nothing about who is speaking." Franny said Judge Redmond identified the voices. Finch said, "The judge has made no formal finding." Franny said the judge said they were among the most deliberate abuses of this court's process she had encountered in 17 years. I believe she had formed some opinion about whose voices she was hearing. A sound from the gallery. Finch's jaw tightened. He said, "Mrs. Calder, you are a former veterinary technician. You have no legal training, no investigative training, no expertise in evidence authentication or procedure. Is that correct?" She said, "Yes." He said, "So when you stand here and present these materials as definitive evidence of a conspiracy, you are doing so without the professional qualifications to assess whether they are what you believe them to be." He said, "Isn't it possible that a grieving widow emotionally vulnerable after the death of her husband might have misinterpreted what she found, might have seen conspiracy where there was ordinary communication?" She looked at him. She said, "No." He said, "How can you be certain?" She said, "Because I was married to a detective for 8 years. I know how he worked. I know how he documented things. The summary in his handwriting, the 2-page summary in the coat, describes exactly what Roy Tillman photographed, and when describes the recording and what it captures and identifies by name the 3 parties present. Edmund wrote that summary when he was still able to write clearly. He was a precise man. He did not make mistakes in his documentation." She said, "I'm not certain because I'm an expert. I'm certain because I knew Edmund Calder." Finch changed direction. He said, "The letter. the handwritten letter that you attributed to your mother. You claim to recognize the handwriting." Franny said, "I do recognize it." He said, "Your mother is 88 years old. Handwriting changes significantly with age, with tremor, with reduced motor control." Franny said, "I have 30 years of Christmas cards from my mother. I have letters she wrote me when I moved. I have a birthday card from 2 years ago after Edmund and I were married, in which she wrote that she hoped I understood what I had gotten myself into. I know her handwriting." He said, "You've provided none of those comparison documents to this court." She said, "No, but I could. I have them at home." A pause. Finch said, "Mrs. Calder, let me ask you something directly." He said, "You came to this courtroom today without an attorney, without pretrial filings, without any of the procedural protections that a represented party would have. You are asking this court to accept evidence that has not gone through proper discovery, presented by a layperson who cannot be held to professional standards." He said, "Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you hire an attorney and do this correctly?" Franny was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, because the answer had several layers, and she was deciding how many of them the room needed. She said, "I didn't have money for an attorney. Chester's attorneys froze my accounts. You know that you're aware of the circumstances of my financial situation." She said, "But that's not the whole answer." She said, "The whole answer is that Edmund did not hide this evidence for an attorney to find. He hid it for me. He put it in the coat he knew I would wear. He put it where I would feel it against my body every day. He didn't do that so that someone else could stand in a room and explain what he had done. He did that so that I would stand here and do it myself." She said, "He believed I could do it. He believed that because he knew me, which is the same reason he knew I was worth protecting in the first place." She looked at Finch directly. She said, "You asked me why I didn't need anyone to speak for me. The answer is that the truth has already spoken. You heard it 40 minutes ago. It was recorded in a diner on Route 9, and it was in the voices of the 3 people who planned this, and the only thing an attorney could have added to it is a more expensive suit." She said, "I don't need a more expensive suit. I needed the truth. Edmund gave me the truth." She said, "I think that's the answer to your question." Finch stood at the front of the room. He had asked his last question and received an answer he could not work with, and the options available to him had narrowed to nothing. He turned. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. Chester reached for his arm. He said, low and urgent, the specific urgency of a man watching something collapse and needing someone to stop it. "Do something. Tell me you have something." Finch picked up his briefcase. He set it on the table. He looked at Chester. He said, "She has everything." Chester said, "There has to be..." Finch said, "The recording has our voices. The photographs have timestamps. The letter has your name on it. The summary is in Edmund Calder's handwriting, and he was a credentialed investigator for 42 years whose documentation will stand up to any scrutiny." He said, "She has everything." Chester said, "You told me." Finch said, "I told you she wouldn't have representation. She doesn't. I told you the evidence would be limited. It isn't." He sat down. He set his hands flat on the table. He said more quietly, in the specific quiet of a man who has arrived at the end of what he can do, "I'm going to recommend we consider our options before Judge Redmond reconvenes." Chester looked at the front of the room, at Franny sitting at the defendant's table with Edmund's coat on and her hands folded, and the expression of a woman who has said what she needed to say and is now waiting for the rest of the world to do what it was going to do. He said nothing. The clock on the wall marked 2:00. Judge Redmond returned to the bench at 2:43. She had been in her chambers for 31 minutes. When she came through the door, the bailiff called order, and the room stood, and she moved to her seat with the same economy she had moved with all day. Nothing added, nothing performed the specific weight of a woman who had made her decision and was ready to speak it. She sat. She looked at both tables. She opened her folder. She did not begin immediately. She looked at the photographs on the clerk's desk, at the envelope, at the USB drive, at Edmund's 2-page summary in his handwriting. She looked at these things the way a person looked at evidence that had arrived in a form they had not anticipated and had spent 31 minutes considering. Then she began. She said this court has heard the matter of Bramwell versus Calder regarding the estate of Edmund Roy. Calder deceased. She said the plaintiff Chester Bramwell has alleged that the defendant Francis Calder exerted undue influence over Edmund Calder during his illness, and that the estate planning benefiting the defendant should therefore be set aside. The plaintiff has supported this allegation with the testimony of one witness. She said the defendant has produced in response documentary and audio evidence establishing the following: that the plaintiff engaged in a course of conduct designed to corrupt the testimony of a witness through financial payment, that this corruption was arranged with the knowledge and participation of the plaintiff's legal counsel, and that the witness whose testimony was purchased is the defendant's own mother. She said the court finds the plaintiff's claim without merit. She said the estate of Edmund Roy Calder, including the property at 14 Millbrook Road, the vehicle registered to Edmund Roy Calder, and all financial accounts held in Edmund Roy Calder's name or jointly with Francis Calder, passes in its entirety to Frances Ann Calder as the named beneficiary under Edmund Calder's valid will and as the surviving spouse. She said, the freezing of Mrs. Calder's accounts implemented at the plaintiff's request pending this proceeding is lifted effective immediately. The court will issue the appropriate order to the financial institutions before close of business today. She set the folder down. She looked at the plaintiff's table. She said, Mr. Bramwell, the court is referring this matter to the State Bar and to the County Prosecutor's Office for investigation into potential criminal conduct. Specifically, the recorded conversation presented in evidence today documents an arrangement to purchase perjured testimony conducted with the direct involvement of legal counsel. This constitutes at minimum obstruction of justice and suborning perjury. She said the court makes no criminal finding today. That is not this court's function. But the evidence presented in this proceeding will be transmitted in its entirety to the appropriate offices, and this court will cooperate fully with any investigation that follows. She looked at Finch. She said, Mr. Finch, in addition to the referral to the prosecutor's office, the court is filing a complaint with the State Bar regarding your conduct in this matter. A licensed attorney who participates in the corruption of witness testimony has violated his oath to this court and to his profession. The bar will determine the appropriate consequence. This court's view of the severity of that violation is reflected in the language of this referral. She paused. She looked at the witness area, at Margaret Dwyer, who had been sitting with her cane in both hands and her back straight, and her face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone who was not going to give the room the satisfaction of seeing what was happening inside. Judge Redmond said, Mrs. Dwyer. Margaret looked at her. The judge said, I have been on this bench for 17 years. I have presided over estate disputes, custody battles, fraud cases, and proceedings involving every variety of human failure and human harm. I have seen parents used against children and children used against parents and families turned into instruments of cruelty. She said, I do not know what your life has been. I do not know what 67 years of relationship with your daughter has contained. I am not in a position to judge the entirety of that. She said, but I know what you did in this courtroom today. You came here to testify against your own child in exchange for payment. You rehearsed the testimony. You negotiated the price. She said, I don't know how a mother arrives at that decision. She said, I hope you have occasion to think about it. The room was quiet. Franny had her hands flat on the table. At some point during the judge's ruling, she could not have said exactly when, because the moment had not announced itself. Something had let go. Not dramatically. The way things let go when they have been held in tension for a very long time, and the tension is finally no longer required. Something in her chest or her throat, or the specific place where she had been keeping the weight of this morning. She was crying, not loudly, not with her face in her hands. Quietly, the way she did most things with her face, still the tears moving on their own, the specific involuntary quality of tears that were not being performed and were not being suppressed. She was not crying because she had won. She was crying because Edmund had known. He had known this room would exist this morning, would exist this moment where she would need something more than herself. and he had spent his last months in pain and the specific exhaustion of a man whose body was failing, making sure she would not walk into this room empty-handed. He had given her his work. He had given her his eyes and his ears, and 42 years of knowing how to find the truth in places where people had tried to bury it. He had given her the coat. She stood when the judge called order for the final time. She put on Edmund's coat. She buttoned it all the way, all 6 buttons, the coat that was too large for her in the specific way of a garment that had been shaped by someone else's body and would never fully conform to hers, and she had never wanted it to. She picked up the photographs from the clerk's desk and the envelope and the USB drive and the 2-page summary in Edmund's handwriting because these things were hers. She turned toward the door. She stopped. Margaret Dwyer was still in the witness area. She had not stood when the judge called order, had remained seated with her cane and her straight back, and now she was still seated, and she was not looking at anything Franny could identify, just at the middle distance, the specific, unfocused gaze of someone who has been somewhere very difficult and is not yet sure where they are now. Franny walked to the witness area. She stood in front of her mother. Margaret looked up. The 2 women looked at each other, the mother who had spent 67 years describing her daughter as insufficient, and the daughter who had spent 67 years carrying that description, and had only in the last 8 years understood that the description had nothing to do with her. Franny said, "I forgave you a long time ago." She said, "I forgave you because I needed to, because I couldn't carry it anymore, because Edmund showed me that I deserved to set it down." She said, "I want you to know that." She said, "But I will never forget what you were willing to do, not to me, to yourself. What it cost you to walk into this room today, what you traded away for $50,000. She said, "I hope it was worth it to you. I hope somewhere in that there was something you needed badly enough that it was worth it." Margaret did not speak. Her hands on the cane were still. Franny looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "Goodbye, Mama." She turned. She walked down the aisle of Courtroom 7 toward the door at the back, past the gallery that had been watching all morning, past the clerk's desk, and the chairs, and the clock on the wall that read 3:17. She pushed the door open. Outside, the light was different from what she had expected. She had left home in gray, the specific flat gray of a morning that had decided not to commit to weather, and she had been inside for most of 6 hours, and somewhere in those hours the day had made a decision. The sun was on the courthouse steps, not dramatically, not cinematically, just the ordinary afternoon sun of a November day in this county, the sun that had been behind clouds all morning and had come out at some point while she had been in a courtroom, and it had not announced itself. She stood on the steps. She put her hand in the left pocket of Edmund's coat, the repaired pocket, the uneven stitches on the interior seam that she could feel under her fingers, the last careful work of Edmund's hands. The pocket was empty now. The photographs were in her bag. The USB was in her bag. The letter and the summary were in her bag. Everything Edmund had put in the coat had been taken out of the coat and placed before a judge, and had done what he had made it to do. The coat was just a coat now. Just canvas and worn elbows and 6 buttons and the shape of a man she had loved. She stood in the sun on the courthouse steps, and she felt the weight of it on her shoulders, and she thought, this is enough. This specifically, right here, the sun and the coat and the absence of everything she had been carrying all morning. This is enough. She walked down the steps. She walked toward the parking lot. She did not look back. She drove home with the windows down. Not because it was warm, November in this county was not warm, but because she needed the air, the specific moving air of a drive that was carrying her from one version of her day to another. And she had learned long ago that transitions required something physical to mark them. Edmund had done this too. He had always opened the car windows after a difficult case, regardless of the season. She had teased him about it once, and he had said, "It clears the evidence out of my head." She had understood what he meant in the abstract. She understood it more specifically now. The house came into view at the end of the driveway. She had been afraid to look at it directly for 6 months, had been living in it the way you lived in a place under dispute, the way you inhabited something you were not certain you would be allowed to keep. Looking at the porch, looking at the windows, checking unconsciously whether the house still looked like hers. She pulled into the driveway. She sat for a moment. The house looked back at her the way it always had. She opened every window. Starting at the front, the sitting room, the windows Edmund had replaced 3 years ago because the old ones let in a draft, a project he had undertaken with the specific focused pleasure of a man who enjoyed solving practical problems and had not expected to still be around to see how they worked. They had worked. She pushed them open, and the November air came in carrying the smell of the yard and the specific quality of outdoor cold that was different from indoor cold and that the house had been keeping out for too long. The kitchen. The study where Edmund had worked she had not changed. It had not been ready to change it, and she was still not ready. But she opened the window and the air moved through the room that smelled of his work, and she let it. The bedroom last. She stood at the bedroom window for a while. The yard below. The oak tree Edmund had planted the second year they were here, which was already larger than either of them had expected it to get this quickly. The garden bed she had put in last spring, which had needed tending for months, and which she had been neglecting because she had not had the capacity for it, and which was still there, still hers, still capable of being tended. She would tend it. Not today, but it would not wait indefinitely, and she would not make it wait indefinitely. She turned from the window. She took Edmund's coat from her shoulders. She carried it to the closet and found the good hanger, the one they had bought at a shop in town that sold proper wooden hangers, which Edmund had thought was excessive, and she had thought was correct, and they had argued about pleasantly for 5 minutes, and then she had bought 3 of them. She hung the coat on the good hanger. She smoothed the shoulders. She left the closet door open. She ate dinner at the kitchen table. Simple eggs toast the specific, uncomplicated meal of a person who has spent a long day doing something difficult and has arrived at the end of it and needs sustenance more than experience. She ate slowly. She looked out the window at the yard, going dark. She thought about Edmund, not with the specific, focused grief of the months since April, the grief that arrived in waves that had a quality of searching to it, the grief of a person looking for someone who was not there. She thought about him the way she thought about the oak tree in the yard as a thing that was present in the place it had been planted, that had done what it had intended to do, that was still growing in the ways that things grew after they were done. He had been a detective. He had seen something wrong developing, and he had documented it with the tools. He had a phone call to Roy Tillman, a camera, a recording device, the 2-page summary he had written in the months when writing had still been possible. And he had placed the documentation where it would be found by the right person at the right time. He had found her worth protecting. She had always known this. Today, she had seen the shape of how. The letter from Margaret arrived on a Thursday 1 week after the hearing. No return address. She recognized the handwriting before she opened it, which was a thing she suspected Margaret had anticipated, given that she had mailed it anyway. It said, "I'm sorry." 2 words, and then her signature. Franny read it standing at the kitchen counter. She read it again. She folded it along its crease. She did not respond. She did not throw it away. She put it in the drawer with the Christmas cards and the birthday cards and the 30 years of correspondence that had accumulated between them, the record of a relationship that had been what it had been and would not be revised by 2 words on a card. But that was also not nothing, because Margaret was 88 years old and had put pen to paper and had written those 2 words, and that was a thing that had happened in the world and deserved to exist somewhere. She closed the drawer. The Edmund Calder Scholarship Fund was announced in the spring. Small, she was not a wealthy woman, and the fund reflected that design to provide practical support rather than large sums. It offered coursework fees for women over 50 who were pursuing investigative work or paralegal training, or any of the adjacent skills that Edmund had spent his career using. The specific population he would have noticed: women who had come late to the work, women who had been told they were too old to start something new, women who had reasons to understand that the truth required active pursuit, and who needed the tools to pursue it. The announcement was in the county paper and the community board at the library and at the veterinary clinic, where she still occasionally volunteered. At the small gathering for the announcement held in the front room of the house, 12 people, the afternoon light coming through the windows she had opened, someone asked her what had inspired it. She said, "My husband believed that the truth always found a way to be known. He believed that the work of finding it was specific work, that it required patience and attention, and the willingness to document what you saw." She said he also believed that the people most likely to do that work carefully were often the people who had been underestimated long enough to develop patience. She smiled. She said he was usually right about things. After the gathering, when the room had emptied and the cups had been collected, and the afternoon had done what November afternoons did, she stood in the front room alone. On the wall beside the window in a frame she had found at a shop downtown, plain wood. Nothing excessive was Edmund's coat. Not the coat itself. The coat was still on the good hanger in the closet, still wearable, still hers to wear when the weather was cold, and she wanted to be in it. What was in the frame was a photograph Edmund wearing the coat on a Tuesday morning some years ago, standing in the driveway with his keys in his hand, squinting slightly at whoever was behind the camera. She had been behind the camera. He had been heading out to a case some Tuesday, one of the hundreds of Tuesdays that had accumulated into 8 years and then stopped accumulating. She had taken the photograph because she liked the way he looked in the coat, and she had wanted the image of it. She had not known when she took it that the coat would be what it turned out to be. Below the photograph, a small card in her own handwriting. He watched. He listened. He kept the evidence. She put her hand against the frame. The glass was cool. The room was warm. She stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, not making any decisions, not preparing for the next thing. Just standing in her house in the last of the afternoon light, with her hand against the glass, and Edmund's face on the other side of it, and the November evening coming down outside the windows she had opened. She had been loved, once completely by the right person. It had been enough. It was still enough. It would go on being enough.